The ice scraper bit into the iced windshield of my 2012 Subaru with a harsh, rhythmic screech. Outside, the Boston wind didn't just blow, it cut straight through wool, denim, and skin. It was 4:30 in the morning. On the dashboard, the digital clock blinked its indifferent red numbers, matching the chill in my bones. I tapped the screen of my phone, sliding the rideshare app from offline to online. The screen flashed green. A ping chimed almost instantly, a $7 airport fare across the slush-covered bridge. At 44 years old, this was what my life looked like. A decade-old SUV, a tank of regular gas, and a 14-year-old daughter named Maya, asleep in a drafty apartment 3 miles away, whose private school tuition hung by the thread of whatever cash I could clear before sunrise. Grief doesn't pause the rent, regret doesn't buy groceries, and a shattered family name doesn't keep out the draft. I want you to understand where I was sitting when my world officially ended, because it makes the rest of this story land the way it's supposed to. 2 weeks prior, I had been sitting in a polished glass and mahogany conference room on the 45th floor of a downtown financial tower. I wore a navy polyester suit I'd bought off a clearance rack at a thrift store down on Tremont Street, the kind of outfit you wear when you can't afford dignity, but you want to look like you're trying. Across from me sat a corporate attorney whose tie cost more than my entire wardrobe, reading aloud the final testament of my father, Evelyn Sterling. My father was a man who built a kingdom out of raw concrete, leverage, and ruthless ambition. Sterling Holdings was a $120 million empire of commercial towers, luxury waterfront developments, and prime Boston real estate. His name was etched into the city's skyline on the sides of skyscrapers. But inside that conference room, his name meant something else to me: complete erasure. The voice droned on through legalese, itemizing the distribution of the estate. The Sterling Tower commercial hub went to my oldest brother, Sterling Jr., whom everyone called Grant. The waterfront penthouses, the private yacht docked in Cape Cod, and the controlling shares of the holding company were split between Grant and my middle brother Mason. They sat there in their custom-tailored Tom Ford suits, looking like princes taking inventory of their treasury. And then the reading concluded. My name was not in it. Not a single line, not a mention, not a token gesture, not even a parting dollar. The silence in that room was heavy, thick with the uncomfortableness of corporate executioners who knew they had just witnessed a public disowning. I didn't gasp. I didn't slam my hands on the table. I just sat there, staring at the polished mahogany grain of the desk, feeling the familiar hollow weight settling back into my chest. The exact same weight I'd carried since I was a teenager, walking out of that house for the very last time. Then Grant stood up. He walked around the mahogany table, leaned over my chair, and placed a heavy paternal hand on my shoulder. He leaned in close, bringing the scent of expensive cologne and absolute contempt right to my ear, ensuring no one else could catch the frequency of his malice. I didn't blink. I didn't pull away from his hand, because pulling away would have given him the satisfaction of knowing he had bruised me. I simply looked up into his cold, triumphant eyes, stood up without a word, smoothed down the skirt of my thrift store suit, and walked out of the building. I didn't go home to cry. I got into my car, turned on the ignition, and drove back to the working-class streets to pick up strangers for minimum fare, because the meters of survival don't care about a broken heart. For 44 years, I had accepted the arithmetic of my existence. I was the discarded daughter, the collateral damage of a man who measured human worth in square footage and net operating income. I had built a quiet life away from them, a life of small honesties and quiet struggles. I thought I knew the exact boundaries of my father's cruelty. I thought he had written me off because I didn't have the stomach to be a shark. I was wrong about every single thing.
But it took a total stranger stepping into the back of my car on a freezing Tuesday night to dismantle the lie I had lived inside for a quarter century.
To understand why my father left me out in the cold when he died, you have to go back 25 years to a winter that changed everything. You have to look at a single, historical brick building on Hawthorne Street. It was the very first piece of real estate my father ever acquired, back in 1971, long before the multi-million-dollar towers. It was a modest apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood, housing families living paycheck to paycheck, retired mechanics, and elderly widows. For reasons my younger self could never fully grasp, my father always kept the rents on that specific property remarkably low. By 1999, I was 19 years old and studying architecture locally. I still spent weekends around my father's offices, and Hawthorne Street held a special place in my heart. One of its residents was a 78-year-old woman named Clara. She had lived in apartment 4B for over 30 years, and she was the closest thing to a grandmother I had. When I was a little girl accompanying my father to inspect the property, Clara used to keep a small glass dish of peppermint candies on her worn wooden table, just for me. That winter, the quiet routine of Hawthorne Street shattered. My oldest brother, Grant, had recently stepped into an executive role within Sterling Holdings. Hungry to prove his worth to my father and maximize short-term profits, Grant set his sights on Hawthorne Street. The neighborhood was gentrifying, and Grant calculated that if they gutted the old building, luxury renovated the units, and brought in high-paying tenants, the rental revenue would triple overnight. There was only one obstacle: the people who currently lived there. Grant didn't evict them legally right away. Instead, he deployed a systematic campaign of psychological attrition designed to make the tenants break and leave on their own. Maintenance requests were ignored. The building's heating system mysteriously failed during the coldest weeks of January. Confusing notices filled mailboxes, threatening code violations and sudden rent hikes. One freezing evening in late January, my phone rang. It was Clara. Her voice was shaking so hard she could barely articulate her words through muffled weeping. She told me that corporate men had banged on her door, measured her rooms, and told her to pack her bags. She asked me a simple, heartbreaking question. "Diane, is your family trying to make me homeless?" I drove straight to Hawthorne Street. What I saw when I walked into that hallway sickened me. The radiator in the corridor was stone cold, wrapped in frost. Older tenants stood wrapped in heavy blankets in their doorways, shivering. The machine of my own family, the empire built by my father, was actively crushing an elderly woman who had given me peppermint candy when I was a little girl. The next morning, I walked straight into my father's corporate office on the 40th floor, pushed open the mahogany doors, and stood right in front of his massive desk. I was 19 years old, shaking with absolute fury, and I laid out everything Grant was doing. I told him it was cruel and demanded he stop it. My father sat back in his leather chair, his face an unreadable mask of cold granite. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at me across the polished wood and delivered a sentence that felt like a physical blow. "This is business, Diane. Go home." Those 4 words broke something fundamental inside me. I looked at the man who had raised me and realized he had traded his soul for square footage. I didn't go home. I looked him dead in the eye and told him no. I told him if he wouldn't stop his company, I would find someone who could. For a 19-year-old college student to wage war against her own family's real estate conglomerate was unheard of. I took every internal memo regarding the displacement tactics I had quietly gathered, and I walked straight into the headquarters of the Greater Boston Tenants' Rights Organization. I helped Clara and her neighbors organize a legal defense. I spoke to local journalists. I forced the harassment into the public spotlight.
The media fallout was immediate. Within a week, facing intense public backlash and city code violations, Sterling Holdings was forced to completely drop the redevelopment plan. The eviction notices were rescinded, and Clara stayed in her home. But my victory came with a devastating price tag. My family treated my actions as an unforgivable act of treason. Grant was incandescent with rage, vowing never to forgive me for publicly humiliating the company. In the eyes of my family, I was no longer just the sensitive daughter. I was the enemy within. The tension became unbearable. A few months later, right after my 20th birthday, I packed a single suitcase, walked out of that mansion, and never took another dime from the Sterling estate. I paid my own way through college, refusing every check and every lifeline. I wanted to build a life with clean hands. As I walked away that day into the cold Boston night, I locked a permanent belief into my heart. I believed my father had chosen his empire over his daughter. I had no idea my act of rebellion hadn't driven him away. It had changed him forever.
For 20 years, I tried to prove that a clean conscience could build a home. I married a good, steady man who shared my aversion to corporate blood money, and together we welcomed our daughter, Maya. When that marriage gently drifted apart years later, we parted with a quiet handshake and a shared commitment to co-parenting, leaving me as her sole daily provider. To make ends meet without leaning on any outside help, I opened a small custom woodworking and furniture restoration shop in a quiet suburb west of Boston. In that dusty workshop, surrounded by the warm scent of sawdust, linseed oil, and old pine, I finally found a strange kind of peace. There was an honest rhythm to it all. I would take a scarred, broken dining table left behind by time, strip away the old, ruined varnish, sand down the deep gouges, and reveal the rich, stable grain hidden beneath. Day after day, watching the raw wood transform under my own hands, I foolishly believed I was doing the exact same thing to my own life. I thought I was repairing the damage of my past. I was creating something sturdy, independent, and real out of my own labor, safely hidden away from the glass towers and cold boardrooms of the Sterling Empire. For 12 years, my little shop kept us afloat. It wasn't luxury, but it was safe. It was ours. Then came the economic downturn, swift and merciless like a winter gale. The retail landscape shifted overnight, swallowed whole by massive online home goods chains and corporate-backed franchises that could undercut any artisan price by half. At the exact same time, my commercial landlord doubled the monthly lease, citing the neighborhood's aggressive gentrification and rising property taxes. I fought for 6 months, draining every cent of my meager savings accounts, working 18-hour days until my hands blistered and my joints ached with chronic pain. It wasn't enough. The cold math of survival finally caught up to me. On a Tuesday morning in November, I stood in the middle of an empty workshop, staring at bare concrete floors where my workbench used to stand. I had just sold my professional wood lathe, my vintage hand planes, and my mother's silver-plated tea set just to pay off the final utility bills and break the commercial lease penalty. At 44 years old, I was staring at a blank page with a negative balance in my checking account. That was the week I liquidated the last of my personal belongings of any real market value. A gold locket from my college graduation, a box of old camera gear, just to buy a rusted, high-mileage 2012 SUV that could barely pass safety inspection for a rideshare app. People who haven't lived on the sharp edge of poverty think it's just about not having a lot of money in the bank. They don't understand that poverty is a physical, suffocating weight that alters the way you breathe every single minute. It turns every day into a desperate, silent calculation of scarcity.
Every evening after picking Maya up from her public high school, I would slide behind the steering wheel of my dented SUV and log into the app, driving through the glittering, indifferent streets of downtown Boston until 3 or 4 in the morning. And that was the cruelest irony of my new reality. As I navigated the wet, freezing asphalt, my tires would constantly roll past the towering silhouettes of downtown real estate carrying my family's name, including Sterling Tower, where my brother sat in glass-walled offices drinking scotch and managing fortunes worth more than small countries. My knuckles would turn white on the steering wheel as I crawled past those monuments of family wealth, knowing that back in the passenger seat of my freezing car, my teenage daughter was quietly eating a paper cup of lukewarm canned soup we had bought with a discount coupon from the corner convenience store. My pocket barely held enough cash for her textbook fees the next morning, let alone a proper dinner or a warm home. I never asked my brothers for a single dime. Pride? Maybe. Or maybe it was just the unyielding stubbornness of a woman who had walked away 25 years ago and swore she would rather starve than let them see her break. I thought I was paying the ultimate price for my integrity. I truly believed that struggling through every single rent payment, counting pennies at the grocery store checkout, and driving total strangers home through the snow was my permanent station in life, earned through an unyielding choice of conscience over comfort. I didn't know that the universe was about to flip the script entirely.
3 weeks had passed since my father's funeral. 3 weeks of chasing midnight fares through the slush and neon of Boston just to keep the heat running in our apartment. The exhaustion had settled deep into my bones, a heavy, permanent fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. Then came a Tuesday afternoon that split my life cleanly in half. It was a quiet, gray afternoon when the app chimed, a pickup request from an upscale corporate law firm in the Back Bay, the kind of prestigious address where marble floors gleamed and hourly legal rates could easily pay my rent for half a year. I tapped the screen, made a quick U-turn through light traffic, and pulled up smoothly to the grand glass doors of the building. The automatic doors slid open, and an elderly gentleman stepped out onto the sidewalk. He wore a heavy, tailored charcoal wool coat and a silk scarf, leaning slightly on a dark wooden cane with a silver handle. Despite his refined appearance, his shoulders carried the unmistakable weight of profound sorrow. He moved with slow steps, opened the rear door, and slid into the back seat of my dented SUV. "Good afternoon," I said, keeping my voice neutral as I checked my rearview mirror. "Welcome." The old man didn't answer immediately. He settled back against the worn upholstery and didn't utter a word about the destination, simply giving me a quiet nod toward the westbound highway. I shifted into drive and pulled away, merging into the sluggish afternoon traffic. But as I kept my eyes on the road, something unusual caught my attention through the glass of the rearview mirror. The old man wasn't looking at the city sliding past the window. He was staring directly at me. His gaze was intense, unblinking, and filled with a raw, overwhelming emotion that made my hands tighten instinctively on the steering wheel. Through the small rectangle of the mirror, I saw his eyes shining with unshed tears, swimming behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. He just studied every line of my face, every angle of my jaw, tracking my features with a heartbreaking mix of recognition and grief. Mile after mile, the silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. We crossed the river, leaving the towering monoliths of downtown behind us and heading deeper into the quiet, tree-lined residential suburbs 12 miles away.
Throughout the entire journey, he never took his eyes off my reflection. The weight of his gaze felt so charged with unspoken history that the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Finally, the GPS announced our arrival. I guided the car down a quiet residential street lined with old Victorian homes and pulled safely to the curb in front of a modest brick townhouse. I put the car in park, engaged the emergency brake, and turned off the blinker. "We're here," I said softly, turning my head halfway to look back at him. The old man didn't reach for the door handle. He sat entirely still in the dim light of the back seat, his hands resting firmly on the silver head of his cane. The tears that had gathered in his eyes finally spilled over, tracking slowly down his wrinkled cheeks. Then he opened his mouth. His voice was old, trembling with decades of suppressed secrets, yet carrying an absolute piercing clarity. "Diane Sterling, keep the car running for just a moment. I have something to tell you, a secret your father paid me to keep locked away for 25 years. My breath caught in my throat. My hands froze on the console. The name Sterling hung in the air between us like a physical blow. Slowly, I turned completely around in my driver's seat, letting go of the steering wheel, and met the wet, desperate eyes of the elderly stranger in the back seat. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice a bare whisper. The old man lifted his head, wiped a tear from his cheek with a trembling hand, and looked straight into my eyes. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said quietly. "I was your father's chief legal counsel, his closest friend for 50 years, and the keeper of the truth you were never supposed to find out in a regular way." Arthur Vance settled back into the worn leather seat of my SUV, his old hands resting gently on the silver head of his cane. The quiet of the residential street wrapped around us like a shield, insulating us from the city noise. He looked at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes steady, and began to pull back the curtain on a quarter of a century of complete deception. He took me back to the exact afternoon 25 years before, right after I had walked out of my father's corporate office, having defied him over the Hawthorne Street evictions. Arthur was standing right there in the corner of that expansive 40th floor office when the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me. He watched my father, Evelyn Sterling, turn away from the desk and walk slowly over to the glass window, watching my small figure step out onto the Boston sidewalk far below. According to Arthur, my father stood in absolute silence for a long time. Then, without turning around, he uttered a sentence that Arthur had remembered word for word every single day since. "She had the courage to look me straight in the eye and tell me I was wrong. Not a single soul in this entire conglomerate has dared to do that for 40 years. That was the moment the first massive twist of my life was revealed. My father had never hated me. He had never discarded me out of anger or callous indifference. Instead, watching his older brothers, Grant and Mason, transform into cold, ruthless corporate sharks, poisoned by the very ambition he had rewarded, he understood with brutal clarity that his $120 million empire was not a blessing. It was a toxic trap designed to rot the soul of anyone who touched it. The decision to cut me completely out of the public will wasn't an act of punishment or spite. It was the most calculating, ruthless, yet fiercely protective act a father could commit. He deliberately pushed me as far away from the fortune as humanly possible, forcing me into the ordinary world so I could live a clean, free life built on genuine human values rather than blood money. But Arthur wasn't finished. The second revelation hit me even harder, dismantling every remaining financial anxiety and survival panic I had carried through my adult life as a struggling single mother. Arthur reached into the heavy leather briefcase resting on the floor beside him and pulled out a thick legal portfolio, along with a single polished brass key attached to an engraved tag. He placed them carefully on the center console between us. He explained that 25 years ago, within 48 hours of our confrontation, my father had quietly summoned him back to the office. Evelyn had legally severed the entire historical 24-unit apartment complex on Hawthorne Street from Sterling Holdings, completely shielding it from the rest of the corporate assets. He placed the property into a strictly protected, irrevocable trust under my name alone, entirely hidden from the reach of my brothers, corporate auditors, or future creditors. I stared at the thick folder, my breath catching, as Arthur addressed the practical realities that usually plague inherited old buildings. He confirmed that the trust wasn't a financial burden or a decaying liability. My father had structured it with a dedicated, ring-fenced cash reserve fund currently holding exactly $1.5 million in liquid capital, accumulated steadily from decades of modest, well-managed rental revenues. Every maintenance cost, structural repair, property tax, and expected emergency was fully pre-funded. I wouldn't have to worry about leaky pipes, broken boilers, or rising municipal taxes. My father had engineered a complete fortress of financial independence for me, executed with absolute silence from the shadows. Sitting there in the dim interior of my old car, staring at the brass key gleaming under the dashboard lights, the ground beneath my feet shifted forever. The man I had spent 25 years resenting as a tyrant had actually spent a quarter of a century protecting me from the very empire he built.
Arthur didn't stop with legal documents and brass keys. He reached back into his briefcase and withdrew a heavy, cream-colored envelope, sealed with plain wax. On the front, my name was written in my father's familiar, heavy fountain pen strokes, the ink darkened to a deep midnight black. It was a letter written years before his death, locked away in his private safe, waiting for the exact day Arthur was instructed to hand it to me. As I unfolded the crisp paper under the dim glow of my dashboard lights, my father's voice seemed to echo directly in my mind, stripped of all corporate armor and stripped of the cold granite he always wore in public. The letter didn't start with excuses. It started with an absolute, brutal confession. He wrote that he was a coward, a man who had conquered the real estate market of New England, yet had completely failed the primary exam of human life, learning how to look his own child in the eye and say the simple words, "I'm sorry," and "I love you." He called me the finest thing I ever created by the sheer carelessness of fate, but the only thing that saved my soul from completely rotting away. Then came the details that made my breath lock in my chest, forcing hot tears to finally break past my control. My father revealed that through Arthur's quiet channels, he had never, for a single day in 25 years, stopped watching over me from a distance. He knew the exact date I graduated college. He had a framed, faded snapshot of my late husband and me cutting our modest wedding cake locked in his private desk drawer. He knew when my daughter Maya was born, keeping track of her school achievements through confidential reports from afar. Most painfully of all, he knew about the collapse of my woodworking shop. He had watched me drain my savings during those brutal 18-hour workdays, fighting a losing battle against economic shifts. He confessed that every fiber of his being had screamed at him to step in, to wire millions into my accounts, to crush my commercial landlord into dust, or to buy back my tools. But he had stayed his hand. He knew that my fierce, unyielding pride was the very thing that made me noble. If he had interfered, he would have robbed me of the only thing I had ever truly owned, my absolute, uncompromised integrity.
I watched you struggle so you could remain whole, and it was the hardest thing I ever had to endure. When I finished reading, the paper trembled in my hands. Arthur gently opened the car door and motioned for me to follow him out into the cold Boston night. We walked across the quiet pavement toward the grand entrance of the historical brick building on Hawthorne Street, the very property I had fought to save 25 years ago. Arthur unlocked the heavy iron glass doors, leading me up the broad, polished wooden staircase all the way to the top floor. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy oak door bearing the number 401. Arthur slid a matching brass key into the lock, turned it with a soft click, and pushed the door open, stepping aside to let me enter first. I stepped inside, and the breath left my lungs entirely. It wasn't a vacant, dusty storage unit. It was a vast, immaculate apartment overlooking the glittering skyline of Boston. But what hit me hardest wasn't the breathtaking view. It was a fully finished workshop space by the sunlit windows, stocked with pristine, professional-grade woodworking tools, custom benches, and fine lumber. On the walls hung framed photographs of my childhood, alongside recent, quiet, candid shots of Maya walking home from school, pictures taken from a distance by someone who loved us from the shadows. Arthur stood by the doorway, his hands resting on his cane, watching my reaction with a gentle, knowing look in his eyes. "Your father kept this apartment empty for 25 years, Arthur said softly, his voice cutting through the silent, reverent air of the room. Standing in the center of that sunlit room, surrounded by the quiet ghosts of a father's secret devotion, the 25-year winter inside my chest finally melted away.
Walking into the top floor apartment, the golden afternoon light poured effortlessly through clean, streak-free window panes, hitting the polished hardwood floor just the way it always used to. Every single corner of the room carried a quiet, meticulous care, maintained down to the smallest detail. I didn't need to ask who had done it. This was the silent, steady hand of the building manager, honoring an unwritten promise made to my father long before he passed away. For the first time in 25 years, my shoulders finally dropped. The air up here didn't smell like stale coffee, cheap fast food wrappers, or the sour, lingering desperation of backseat passengers. It smelled like rich cedar, old paper, and a genuine home. I ran my fingertips across the immaculate workbench my father had built for me, feeling a deep, aching wave of understanding wash over me. His silence wasn't cruelty. It was a fortress he built to keep me safe from the toxic ambition that eventually consumed the rest of my family. When I walked down the grand wooden staircase to the ground floor lobby, I didn't expect a welcoming committee. I just wanted to get my daughter settled into our new reality. But the old residents were already waiting in the courtyard. These were the elderly tenants who had lived in Sterling Tower for decades, the very people I had fiercely protected when I was a hot-headed 19-year-old girl standing up to neighborhood bullies and predatory corporate landlords who wanted to throw them out onto the freezing streets. An elderly man with weathered hands and bright, watery eyes stepped forward from the small group. He didn't say hello or offer polite small talk. He just reached out, his grip surprisingly firm despite his age, and caught my hand tightly in his own trembling palm, holding on as if afraid I would vanish into thin air. "You're back where you belong, aren't you?" His voice cracked slightly before the tears finally spilled over his wrinkled cheeks, tracing slow paths down his skin. "You've always been the proud daughter of this building, the one who gave us our dignity back when nobody else cared about us." Those words hit me right in the center of my chest, tearing open a space that had been locked tight by years of relentless survival mode. I didn't cry.
I just squeezed his hand back, letting the weight of that simple, honest recognition anchor something permanent inside my soul. Moving Maya into this safe, timeless place marked the absolute end of the grueling rideshare chapter. No more midnight anxiety, no more watching the rearview mirror for aggressive fares, or calculating how many more hours behind the steering wheel it would take to afford basic groceries and heating bills. That exhausting life of constant dread was officially behind us, locked away forever in the rearview mirror of my past. As for my older brothers, Grant and Mason, I didn't block their numbers right away. I didn't have to. I simply chose total, absolute silence. Just as my father and our family lawyer, Arthur, had grimly predicted, the moment Evelyn's death became public knowledge, the two greedy men inherited the $120 million estate and instantly turned on each other like starving wolves. Within weeks, they were bleeding millions of dollars into high-priced legal teams, fighting tooth and nail for complete operational control of Sterling Tower. Every legal motion filed, every court injunction requested, every public accusation hurled back and forth, it was all designed to starve the other out. They were slowly, methodically destroying each other in the deep, muddy waters of their own bottomless ambition. I didn't lift a single finger to stop them. I didn't need a single cent of their blood money, and I certainly didn't need a formal revenge plot. My absolute silence, combined with the quiet, unbothered peace of my new life, turned out to be the most devastating counterattack of all. Midway through our second week, Mason called once, his voice tight with panic, frustration, and venom, trying desperately to drag me back into their circus. "You think you've won by hiding out like a coward, Diane? They're eating us alive in court. You still have a legal claim to a share of this empire, so get down here and fight." I looked across our sunlit living room at Maya, who was peacefully unpacking her colored pencils at the wooden table, humming a soft, happy tune to herself. I brought the phone closer to my ear, my voice flat, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. Fight for a cage built entirely on greed? Keep it. Enjoyed tearing each other to pieces. I hung up, blocked the number for good, and turned back to the light. The storm was finally over. I had built nothing, fought no one, and claimed everything that truly mattered: my freedom, my daughter, and my peace. Looking out over the sprawling city skyline from our new home, I finally understood what true victory looked like. It wasn't about power or money. It was about waking up every single morning with a clear conscience and a heart that was completely light, knowing the past could never touch us again.
Sitting by the broad window of our top-floor apartment in Hawthorne Street, I watched the evening traffic crawl along the avenue below, its steady hum blending seamlessly into the quiet rhythm of our brand new life. It is a strange and heavy truth about families like mine that love is so rarely spoken aloud. Instead, it is buried deep under decades of bitter pride, hidden behind heavy closed doors, or locked away safely inside a father's stubborn silence. My father spent his entire life building a massive fortress of concrete and steel to protect this building, yet he never figured out how to build a simple bridge straight to his own children's hearts. For 25 long years, I carried the crushing weight of that silence like a heavy physical anchor dragging me down into the dark. I let myself believe that his cold exterior meant I was completely worthless, an unwanted ghost wandering the cold edges of an empire meant only for my brothers. How many of us waste precious years of our lives waiting for an apology that will never arrive? How many families quietly fracture simply because a proud father or a stubborn child cannot bring themselves to utter 4 simple words: "I am sorry," or "I am proud of you"?
We let our lives get hijacked by petty inheritance wars and toxic ambitions, forgetting that true survival is simply walking away from the cage before the heavy iron door slams shut for good. If you are listening to this right now from the driver's seat of your car, a cramped apartment, or the quiet shadows of your own unresolved past, please hear me out. Do not let the cruel silence of someone who didn't know how to love you trick you into believing you are unlovable. Sometimes that icy distance is nothing more than the profound helplessness of a broken soul that never learned how to open its hands or show vulnerability. You do not need to fight for a seat at a table built entirely on greed. You do not need to bleed yourself dry trying to prove your worth to people who only measure human value in cold dollars and cents. When Evelyn's multi-million-dollar estate finally became a battleground of high-priced lawyers and endless lawsuits, my brothers didn't just fight over property, they exposed the hollow core of everything my father had worked to accumulate. They tore each other apart for total control of Sterling Tower, proving that wealth without grace is nothing more than a slow poison. I didn't need a single penny of it. The greatest revenge, the most absolute victory anyone can ever claim, is absolute peace of mind and the quiet freedom to walk away on your own terms. I reached slowly into my pocket and let out the heavy brass key to the front entrance, letting it rest right in the center of my palm. The metal was cool, solid, and utterly real. It was the exact key my father had secretly set aside for me decades ago, a silent testament to a love he was too guarded to put into words. Looking down at that small piece of metal, 25 years of bitter misunderstanding simply dissolved into the warm evening air. I realized then that I had never truly been rejected or cast aside by my blood. In my father's own stubborn, twisted way, I had been chosen all along, set apart to survive a toxic world that would have otherwise consumed me whole. True wealth isn't measured in the height of a skyscraper or the size of a trust fund. It is found in the simple grace of waking up with a clear conscience, holding your child's hand, and knowing you are finally safe. The storm outside has completely passed. Looking out over the sprawling city lights from our new home, I understood the ultimate truth. I had never been an outcast. I was simply protected from a corrupt legacy, chosen by a deeper destiny before life ever tried to measure my worth in gold. Now, holding my daughter close, I know the past can no longer bind us, and our future is entirely ours to write. When I look at Maya smiling beside me, I finally understand that the deepest wounds do not heal by seeking vengeance. They heal the moment you decide to drop the heavy burden of trying to fix people who are determined to break themselves against their own greed. True freedom is found in letting go of the past completely, opening our eyes to a bright new morning, ready to embrace whatever tomorrow brings, without fear or hesitation, knowing that we are finally safe, at home, exactly where we belong.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in? And what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.